Hello, hello, and welcome back, everybody, to JavaScript Jabber. We're at episode 579, if I'm not mistaken, but that's not what's important. What's important is that we will be talking about Remult. That's like multing, but remulting. I probably stands for multiplex or something like that. Anyway, we have our special guest today, Noam Honig.
Hi.
And Yoni Rapoport.
Hello, that's right.
And then
you
of course,
forgot me.
Wait. And of course, our everyday average panelist, web perf expert extraordinaire, Dan Shapir.
Hey, how are you doing? Hi from a nice and sunny Tel Aviv, where, like I like to say now, the weather is great, but the politicians are terrible.
All
Welcome
agreement.
to planet Earth.
Yeah, no, we got some special people running our political system, ruining our political system, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I don't know much about that, but also some of our listeners don't know much about CRUD apps, and Remult is for CRUD apps. So shall we first talk about what does CRUD mean in 2023, and is it any different from what it meant in Rails?
So CRUD is an acronym for create, read, update, and delete. It's what all data-driven applications do pretty much all the time. Imagine if you have a list of orders for some kind of online store, then you create an order, you read the active orders, you're able to update an order or delete an order. It's the basic operations for any data-driven applications.
So it's not about being a cruddy application. It's actually something that you want to aspire to be, rather than avoid being.
Pretty much. It's something that I want to just exist. Something that I want to just work instead of implementing it again and again and again and again.
Yeah, for sure. I was just kidding. It's also worth noting that when we're looking at how HTTP works, or the HTTP protocol, it's actually built on the concepts of CRUD, the type of HTTP commands that you have, right?
Exactly. I think that when they designed HTTP, they designed it to be a CRUD for resources, where you can get a resource, post a resource, put or patch, still debatable, and delete a resource.
Yeah, although practically speaking, most web applications mostly use just get and post. Not all of them actually use update and delete.
Well, if you are going to dare to use put and patch, you better darn sure use them correctly. Because you can be forgiven for using post for everything. But if you start using put, you better darn sure follow the spec.
Yeah. For those who don't know, get is the read from CRUD. So get, you just give a URL and you get the resource back. And post can be used both for create and for update. Although for update, I think there's also, like you said, there's also a separate command if you prefer. But posting back a form data effectively can be used to put data, like I said, either create or update in the system.
By the way,
and delete, like I said, is rarely used.
If you take a layer above HTTP and look at REST, for example, that's a standard that uses the CRUD methods or actions with put and delete as well, not just get and post. And it's part of the spec and part of how you build a REST API.
And I think we had the acronym CRUD before Rails, but I think when Rails popularized REST, it popularized CRUD because of active record and whatnot. And so for me, that's what it kind of harkens back to, is when I think CRUD, I think cookie cutter stuff. I think things that are easy to create models for, where there's not really complex relationships. It's pretty much parent, child, maybe a mutual relationship like a friendship, but it's pretty straightforward stuff. This is owned by that. This can own one or more things. These things can follow each other. And that's kind of the set of the relationships that I expect to see in CRUD and REST applications.
By the way, I didn't know that REST came out of Rails.
It didn't come out of Rails. It's part of HTTP, but I learned about it with Rails. Ruby on Rails gave you a framework, which then some people went to follow, too strictly, but of, categorizing things. You have users is a collection, favorite books is a collection. Then you have /users, /user ID, /favorite books, /ID, or in the management interface, you could have directly favorite books /ID.
Mm-hmm.
But people got crazy with the nesting things, umpteen layers deep, and then it got really slow because you could just do one request, get profile and have it, fetch the user and their favorite books and their top 10 friends. But people were very draconian about it and then started saying, oh, no. Users has to be fetched separately and bookmarks has to be fetched separately and friend list has to be fetched. And then it was, 100 requests and all those criticisms were out. Huh?
And then we got GraphQL.
even
GraphQL was kind of the opposite draconian approach.
Exactly. Yeah, actually, I go back with CRUD all the way back to the 90s. I think that the first time I heard of CRUD was when I started developing back in the 90s. When SQL was popular.
Well, yeah. I think that CRUD goes all the way back to the 50s or 60s, really. I think that when we started having relational databases, that's when I think CRUD really got popularized. So it's way earlier than the web. But as we are explaining, the web is tied to CRUD, and a lot of the websites that we actually build, unless they're simple content sites, are effectively front end for CRUD applications, because that's at the end of the day what most of us do most of the time. Because if you're building an e-commerce website in one way or another, it's a CRUD application, and so on and so forth.
I just think it's worth mentioning in the context of the conversation we're going to have about Remult, that, like you said, Dan, there's CRUD probably in every basic web app or web system that you build. But I think there's a difference between having CRUD to a certain extent in any web application to having CRUD applications or CRUD intensive applications, business applications where the main function of users is creating data, updating data, fetching complex filters on data, kind of applications that have CRUD really at the core and is used very extensively throughout the systems, as opposed to having a website with a lot of static content and a form here or there, or a CRUD functionality here and there.
So something like an admin console, for example, where you might be managing whatever types of entities, users, or whatever,
or an ERP system, or a CRM system, or other internal custom systems for logistics, for manufacturing. I think Remult, again, Remult can be used in almost any context of web applications, but it has a great advantage in these scenarios for these types of systems.
Mm-hmm. So we've mentioned Remult a couple of times. What is it?
So Remult is a library that is specifically designed to create CRUD applications easily. It allows you to share, first of all, it's TypeScript based and it leverages TypeScript. And the big idea behind it is that previously people used to look at front-end code and back-end code. There were front-end developer and back-end developer, whereas Remult perceives you as an application developer, where you focus on your entities. Okay, you have those entities as the single source of truth, and from those entities, the database is derived, the API is derived, the front-end query language is derived, authorization, authentication. All of those are revolved around a single source of truth, which is the entity itself.
By the way, I have to say, to mention that, obviously it's challenging to describe APIs and usage in a podcast. So it's worthwhile to note that you have a website for the Remult project, and on that website is an excellent and not too long video that really highlights what Remult is. So if for anybody listening who thinks that this sounds interesting, but still has difficulties figuring out exactly what we're talking about, I highly recommend spending a couple of minutes and watching that video. But going back to what you were describing, like when I watched that video and when I listened to your explanations, what kind of struck me in a lot of ways is that Remult kind of does for the front end and for JavaScript and for web applications, kind of like what we mentioned it before, like Rails does for the back end, that it kind of provides a very easy to use interface for accessing, well, effectively databases, right?
Yeah, so Remult is designed to bring the simplicities that you used to have in Rails on the backend, okay, all the way through the full stack, which means in Remult, you define an entity, let's say a person entity that has some fields on it, like first name, last name, birth date, city, whatever. And the same entity is used both for your front-end code and the backend code. And around that entity, there's a concept of repository. I define a repository object. Then when that repository object is used on the front end, it will make REST API calls to the backend. But the same repository object, when it's used on the backend, will make database calls to the database. So effectively, I'm getting the same code style on the front end and the backend, and I'm getting code portability between the front end and the backend in a seamless manner. I'm writing within the same developer frame of mind data-related code on the front end and the backend.
And when you mentioned entity in this context, and also mentioning TypeScript before, is entity a TypeScript interface, or is it a JavaScript class, or is it both? What is an entity in this context?
An entity is a TypeScript type that has members to it, like first name, last name, date, whatever.
So an interface, effectively.
Yeah.
It can also be defined as a class or as a type with a dynamic definition. But what's important is that Remult has to know, it has to have a name for an entity and know the types of fields that it has. And then once you define that on in your code base, Remult automatically creates all the API routes for creating, updating, deleting rows in the database, not only creating the routes, but also implementing the routes. So once they're called from the front end using the query language, using Remult on the front end, the data goes to the back end. Remult handles the JSON between the front end and the back end and stores data or fetches data from the database. And another important thing is that you get a query language you can use from the front end. Those queries get serialized. For example, you want to find person with a last name Shapir. You would define that query using
Nobody wants to find me.
Well, if someone for some reason is crazy enough to want to find you, you define that in your front end query using a type-safe query that is based on the type, the person type, and then that request that filter is serialized and goes to the back end, goes all the way to the database, fetches the data, and returns that to the front end.
So you don't actually write your queries in SQL or something like that. Instead, there's an adapter that translates your TypeScript type-safe query language into, well, it might be SQL if it's an SQL database, but it might be something else if it's some other type of database.
Correct. And that saves you a lot of boilerplate code that we are seeing when we're looking at these big CRUD applications with dozens of entities. You're seeing a lot of boilerplate plumbing code used just to get that data from the front end into the database, to the back end, into the database, and all the way back. So Remult really makes all that boilerplate disappear, and that's part of the fun.
So, for example, if I want to put data into the database that I'm using, if I understand correctly, I can do it in either one of two ways. I can either use Remult on the front end, in which case Remult itself generates REST. I use a Remult object, and that Remult object uses internally RESTful APIs. It generates them itself. On the back end, it implemented the endpoint. So it receives those APIs and performs the operations on the database. Or alternatively, I use the exact same API on the back end, in which case there's obviously no RESTful APIs. It just talks directly to the database. Correct?
Correct. And another fun thing you get just by using that, because again, Remult works with your entity types and not with raw SQL or other types of raw REST calls that you're making, we were able to really add we've done that recently, to add a feature we call live queries, which means that with a slight change of syntax from the front end, instead of fetching static data into your React component, for example, you can subscribe to a live query that pushes data from the backend back to you, back to the front end, whenever whenever any relevant change occurs in the database. So again, because of this simple syntax, that can just happen out of the box.
How that sounds pipe dreamy. It sounds like one of those things that's easy to put on a slide and hard to make work in practice. Has a lot of caveats of, oh, well, but it works if you do it this way. It works with this database. It works as long as you don't update a sub-property that isn't broken out by, So what are the caveats there? What's the real story?
We never heard that. What you're saying, we never heard that about Remult. It's the first time we hear that, there has to be caveats and there has to be things that don't work if you don't really use it the same. But no, you can go ahead. Tell them.
Yeah, so once you start abstracting that repetitive operations, then you can extend them and push their limits. So if I'm in control of the REST API and every update goes through my code at some point, I can just as easily be able to publish it when I need it. So what we've done there, we've created imagine you have a query. I'm saying, look for people with last name Shapir. Okay, so it's a REST API, it's a get, and it gets people with the last name Shapir. I see
I'm going to be the butt of every query in this show today.
Sorry.
Probably, and until you'll divert it to, Rapoport or something else, so we can do that. So you define that GET request, and it goes to the backend and gets the data. With a slight change of code, instead of using find, you use live query, and instead of then, you use subscribe. That same REST GET request will also issue a subscribe to a server event. Okay, and with the basic implementation, we're using HTTP server events, and we can scale up to WebSockets and up to industry standards tools like Ably or PubNub. But the developer experience is simple. You just change 2 lines of code. Instead of find, you do live query. Instead of then, you do subscribe. The backend itself has an understanding that you are registered to a specific query. So when an update comes to that dataset, it knows to push messages back to you. Now, we started with a dream. We want this to be the developer experience. We want this to be the API. Okay, and then we started implementing it, and it works. It works and it scales. And
so I want to pull us back to the more basic things for a minute, because if somebody's listening to us, the obvious question is, this is really cool, but I'm using React to build my front end web applications, or I'm using Vue, or I'm using Angular, or I'm using Svelte. So am I using Remult instead of these frameworks, or in addition to these frameworks? How is the rendering implemented?
So Remult is what we like to call play nice with others. Remult covers the communication layer between the front end to the back end to the server. On the front end, you can use Angular, Vue, React, Svelte, Solid, or
Quick
Vanilla.js. It's not a problem. And also on the back end, you can use Node.js with Express or Festify or Koa or Next. Okay, or we're getting close to also SvelteKit or even Dino Fresh. The idea here is that Remult doesn't control everything. It's a library that you add to a project and provides you value where you need it. It doesn't dictate things to you. It doesn't force things on you when you use it. Does that make sense?
For example, Remult has no opinions over how you handle your front-end state management. Okay, you can use things like React Query, or you can, if you're using Vue, you can use the whatever Vue store that you want to use. It also has no opinions on your backend framework. We've had implementations using Remult with Express, Fastify, Nest.js. It's just, you tie it at a certain end on your back end and on your front end and use it to handle the communication and do what Remult does best, which is fetch data all the way from the database to your front end and also back. We also haven't mentioned, just a quick note about Remult. It also adds other things that you can define declaratively at the entity level and have reused both on the front end and the back end. One of the things is validation. We found it a real issue with developers defining data validations, either simple data validations such as email validation or phone number, and up to more complex stuff. And we found duplicate code defining the same validation on the front end and on the back end, or sometimes the code gets different along the way, or people forget to validate on the back end and the front end. With Remult, it's a lot easier because you define the validation at the field level in your entity type. And that validation Remult will enforce that both on the front end code before it makes the network call, the HTTP call to the back end, and in the back end before any data goes into the database.
So I'll get to that in a minute, but because I wanted to just to make sure that the previous point was clear before we go there. So to emphasize the fact that Remult really effectively is not a framework. Remult, or the way that you're describing it, Remult is a library that's intended to serve a very particular purpose, which is to access CRUD data sources effectively and easily and type safely from the front end and the back end, regardless of which framework you might be using. Is that a description that you would agree with?
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, I think that describes it very well. Another layer that it adds is also things that we've seen in many boilerplate codes that we've seen for Get. Like it's automatic has paging built right into it. It also has server-side sorting and server-side filtering built right into it. You see a lot of these apps that started like with some developer developing something, getting all the data, doing front-end work, and then when they reach 10,000 rows, the website collapses. Remult is designed from the ground up to give you all of those advanced functionalities without any cost. You just get them on your API. Okay, so you get server-side paging, sorting, filtering, and live query, as Yoni mentioned, without having to invest in developing and designing it all the way up and down, back and forth.
So if I'm building a React, let's say, application that needs to deal with a database, and I don't feel like doing SQL, and I don't have a backend developer who will create some sort of microservice in, I don't know, Go or Java or whatever, and I need to deal with the database myself, then Remult is a tool that I can use to really simplify that process, if I understand correctly.
And I would even add to that, if you are a lazy backend developer like I am, who doesn't like to create those repetitive endpoints for put, post, delete, and get for every one of your entities with re-implementing paging and re-implementing server-side whatever, and rewriting those SQLs, at the end of the day, backend developers spend so much time writing that code that is just copied and pasted with the mistakes, with the security vulnerabilities. And at the end of the day, it just does the same thing. It's just written again and again and again. So if you're a backend developer who doesn't like maintaining tons of code and rewriting validations that happen on the front end and the back end, and doesn't like typing errors, then you would also use Remult.
So a few more questions about that. And so first of all, it is open source software, right? So is there a licensing fee or something like that, or you can just take it and use it?
Remult is completely open source and will forever be open source.
Okay. The next question is, what databases does it work with?
So Remult has a nice little abstraction around the database where I can use the same API to query REST on the backend, and then I can use it on the backend to access the database. And so in terms of databases that we've implemented so far, we have a Postgres, of course. We have Knex, which is a library it's a backend library that allows me to access MySQL and SQLite, Oracle, SQL Server, Postgres, and several other databases. There's implementation also for MongoDB. And we also have front-end implementations for the browser SQLs, the web SQL, and for the browser local storage. And we have a nice implementation on the backend that uses plain JSON files, and that's actually how I like to start my project.
Yeah, so I have to touch on that myself, because when I watched the video, that part really blew me away, and I really have to give you a lot of props for that. So just to clarify what that is, like you said, that effectively you create as part of Remult itself, you have like a built-in simple, I won't really call it a database, I'll call it a database in quote, that's a database-like facade for a bunch of JSON files. So each JSON file represents a record,
an entity,
a collection,
and the benefit there is that you can use it during development, first of all, before you even have a database. So if you just want to try it out without setting up a database, or you haven't really decided which database you want to use, or obviously you can also use it during debugging if you don't want to, if you don't have like a staging database in place and you want to play around with data and not create any damage or something like that. So I thought that it was a really, really cool idea. I've not seen it done anywhere else. Maybe others are doing it. I'm not familiar with it. Did you notice that, AJ, when you were looking at that video?
So, well, I think so. I was listening to it. I wasn't watching it, and also I'd clicked on the Discord link, and so it was the video when the video was quarter size rather than normal size. So I was listening to it and I'd glance over. So I think I heard I think I heard that part, but I did not actually visually see it.
The idea behind it, the idea that we had behind it is that when I'm starting to write an app, I just want to write my business logic. I don't want to waste time setting up databases, configuring tons of things or whatever. I want to write a few lines of code and get some data I can play with. So to get there, we try to minimize the number of lines of code to get to an actual business logic application. And we said, okay, a database is an abstraction. I can use anything. So let's start with a very basic JSON file-based database that stores every entity in a separate file. And you can go pretty far with that. You can create a full-blown app. And when you're done, decide on the database that you want to deploy to. And like I have applications where I develop using JSON and I deploy using Postgres. And that's great. It just works.
So two things on that. One, that is what Uncle Bob says in his book, Clean Architecture. He says that people, and the Go authors have said pretty much the same thing, but about typing systems rather than about databases, that why would you make a decision that's so hard to change up front when you know the least about how your app will work and what your users will need than you will ever know at any other time? So right. You want to delay that as long as possible. Also, I was in an interview one time, an interview that I passed, but ended up taking a different offer. And the guy asked a question about, let's say we need to build an app for car dealerships, and hypothetically it's going to be Chevrolet, and they're going to have a car sale, and they're going to need listings for the prices of the sale for every single one of their dealerships, and it's got to be highly scalable, and it really, it's got to be performant, it's got to be scalable. What do you do? And I looked at him shamefully, and I kind of shrunk back a little bit, and I said, honestly, there's got to be 100 to 1,000 dealerships per state. There's 50 states. You're talking about maybe 100,000 records, but probably not even that much. So I would just put it in a JSON file and replicate the JSON file. And the guy looked at me and he said, I have been waiting 10 years for someone to give me that answer. I have heard every answer in the universe, and I have been waiting literally 10 years to interview someone and have them tell me that answer, because that is the right answer.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that you can probably run everything on a single node instance, and you don't need like the scale out, whatever. Probably you want two for redundancy, but yeah. Anyway, but going back to the database thing. So you listed the number of databases that you support. Do you have like a sort of an plugin type architecture that makes it easy to add additional databases? Like, I don't know, I need to support one that you currently don't. Is there a way for me to create this integration myself without having to wait on you to do it?
Yes, exactly that. A database is just an implementation of a very basic interface. It's relatively easy to implement. So you can very easily extend and add more databases. I'm adding a database in just an hour or two when I need to. I got it. Actually, I've been recently in a hackathon where I needed to use Google Sheets as a database. So I ended up writing an adapter to use Google Sheets as a database. Or on another project, I needed to use Monday's API as a database. So you can actually abstract any data source as a database, implement that interface that is needed, and you get the full Remult capabilities end to end.
Okay, so that was one question. The other is we kept on talking about entities that are effectively TypeScript types or TypeScript interfaces that you can say describe a record if you're thinking relational databases. Do I need to make sure manually that entity definition matches the database schema? Is that something that you do for me now or maybe in the future? How does that work?
Okay, so usually when I write code, I'm one of those guys that prefer to write code first and let the code create a database for me. We actually have a very simple engine in Remult that when the server starts, and if obviously you choose to enable it, it will automatically create the entities if they're missing in the database and will add columns that are missing. So if you add columns, those are added automatically. We found that this creates a very forward compatible and backward compatible database migration simplification solution. And we also have codes that can read existing data schemas and generate those TypeScript classes for them. We are planning to create a CLI so you could be able to just run it yourself and not just copy the code from one of our articles and run it in your code, but create a nice CLI to get it running for you.
Have you heard of SQL C?
Is that a JavaScript library?
It's a Go library.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not. It's the outer shell is Go. It uses the MySQL or the Postgres parser. It started as Postgres. It uses the C code parser to read migration files, and then it can spit out JSON that is the final output. So it can read a directory that has 100 migration files, and it can spit out JSON that is, here is the schema after every single one of the migration files has been applied. So this is the schema as it will exist in the database, assuming that all of the migrations in the migration folder have been applied in order. So you don't have to write any custom logic for, well, MySQL has this special pragma or proprietary syntax, and Postgres has this proprietary syntax. Hopefully you're not using MySQL anyway, but you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You simply get the JSON that represents the schema at the end of it all. And then you can use that to instantiate your types. But the one thing, and in the case of SQL C, it'll generate Go code. And of course you could use the JSON to generate JavaScript code as well. There are people that have written adapters to generate other languages other than Go. But the one thing that I am curious about, and it's fine if you don't have a solution for this because I don't think there is a good one, but I love the idea of if you see a new column, add a new column. You can run a migration to upgrade from one column to another. But if I want to then rename that column back to the original column, is that possible? Or do I need to have like a name and then a name v2 and a name v3, and then I would just delete name and name v2?
So that's a concern that's currently external to our implementation. When I do those in my projects, I create specific code into specific projects to handle them. And I think that's also one thing about Remult is that we don't try to solve all the problems. We're trying to solve the 90% of problems where we're spending 90% of our time just repeating ourselves and doing things. So with the approach for migrations, we said, okay, adding entities, adding columns, it's safe, it doesn't break things, it's forward and backward compatible. And when I need additional migrations, we have a code sample on our website where how you can implement more specific migrations, and we just add them as we need them on the projects that we're working on. Personally, myself, I don't like deleting columns, and I view the database as a secondary artifact in my code. Okay, so I don't mind if my code will have a column called first name, and it will have a small annotation telling it in the database it's actually first name 5. Okay, just like you've mentioned, although I don't do that often. But even if I do, it's okay because I consider the database as storage on those aspects.
I really respect that. I like that a lot. That sounds very reasonable. I think that one of the reasons SQL gets a bad rap is the same reason that REST and GraphQL have a bad rap, is there's this draconian approach that you have to do the absolute. There's no middle ground. And I very much like the idea that, yeah, if you need to migrate your database, you can literally just read each row in, change the value, update the column, write it back out, and have the name of the column that a field maps to change in your code. And this doesn't require specific database expertise. It's portable across databases. This is not something that it's, to me, that seems very approachable. It would be a little unintuitive that name might map to name 5, but I think that that's a very acceptable trade-off when you consider all the complexities that could happen, and pardon my French, what a SQL head would probably tell you to do.
Yeah, but so often these days I see people just putting JSON data inside SQL tables. So
we're not proponents of that.
You're not proponents of that, but I see it anyway, where you have a field called data, and that field contains a JSON blob. I see that so often.
If you don't need it to be indexed, if it's stuff like comment or, I can't think off the top of my head the types of fields would be there, but if it's not something that you're going to query or index, I don't have any problem with that.
But if it's simple to normalize, why not? I mean, if it's not extra work to normalize.
Yeah, and really, your approach is kind of the opposite of that, because we talked about the fact that you strive to be as typed as possible. So really, your approach is not to look at things as blobs of data, but rather as typed fields, which brings me back to one of the things that you were talking about before, Yoni, and I kind of took us somewhere else, which was about the validation. So you talked about the fact that you can validate data on the front end, which is useful to give quick responses to users, so that if they type something incorrectly, they don't have to wait for the round trip to get the correction or to the form submit. But you obviously also need to validate on the back end for data correctness and security purposes, because you can never trust the front end. So it's great that you have a mechanism in place that effectively can leverage the same validation on both sides. That's really cool, and I like it a lot. It kind of goes to the whole concept of the modern JavaScript frameworks, which can do the same rendering or templating mechanisms on the front end and the back end. So like I said, I really like that. And what I noticed is that the way that you implement it is using decorators, that you're kind of really influenced in that way by Angular, by Nest. So can you elaborate about this a little bit?
Just to add one point about the validation, what was very important for us with validation is to make it as simple as possible, but also support as many cases as possible by using validations which are JavaScript functions and not, regular expressions or some type of validation language. We wanted actual TypeScript, or JavaScript code to run both on the same code, to run both on the front end and the back end, so that we can create as complex validations as we want and be able to use it. So that was just one important point I wanted to make about that. But yeah, no, go ahead.
So in terms of decorators, we started out with decorators because, we were influenced by Angular and by Nest and by others. And as we evolved, we now support also, on-the-fly types that don't really require the decorators themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're using Remult, you can use, specifically in the next versions it's going to come out, you can even use any other typing library that exists in TypeScript with Remult. Okay, so the current version of Remult, you define a class and use decorator to add metadata to the columns like validations, authorization, to the columns and the entity itself. You also have a secondary way of creating it just by defining the class on the fly. You decide it's going to have a field, it's going to be of type string, and it's going to do the same similar syntax to what you would use with Zod or with Typebox or others. So from that, the type will be derived, and the same functionality of decorators will work like that. And we are also planning to support that you'll be able to use Zod types and type box types and pretty much any other typing language to define your types, and then have Remult handle the database all the way to the front end, communication back and forth. It actually brings me to another small topic that we cover, but I think it's also important. When you look at a data type, consider, for example, date. Okay, it's I'm a software developer for well over 20 years, and I'm still surprised that date is an unsolved problem. Okay, date in the database is represented in one way, in memory in another way, and in the DTOs that people send back and forth in the JSON objects, it's represented in a third way. And we spend so much time translating between these types back and forth from the front end to the back end. So this is again one of those concerns that you solve once on the entity level. You can actually define for each field on the entity level how it's stored in the database, how it goes and serialized to a DTO, and how it's presented in memory. Okay, we have, and actually how it's also inputted in an HTML input. So when I read it from the database, maybe it's a date time, maybe it's a string, maybe even it's a number, and I'm translating it to a date in memory. When I'm moving it to JSON, I'm moving into the JSON standard of date. And when I'm translating into an input, okay, to an HTML input, I'm translating it to the way an HTML input wanted to happen. And instead of writing that code again and again and again in multiple frameworks, multiple endpoints, this again gets in our single source of truth and covered end to end.
I think that's really cool. I think there's a lot of power in, let's say, standardizing and normalizing the flow of the data. Because at the end of the day, especially when working on CRUD applications, effectively that's what you do. A lot of times when I try to explain to people why frameworks are so successful in web development, my explanation is that at the end of the day, most of us are writing the same sorts of applications over and over again. And very often those applications are CRUD applications. So anything that can automate and streamline as much of the process of building such applications is definitely a good thing. And the success, for example, of Rails is a testament to that. So if you can bring the same sort of things to the JavaScript or TypeScript world, I think that's a huge benefit. By the way, we were talking about decorators. It's also worth noting that decorators have recently moved to a stage 3 proposal in the context of ECMAScript. So for now, we're still relying on TypeScript to compile the decorators away, but pretty soon it will be able to actually leave the decorators in the resulting JavaScript code, and it will be handled by the JavaScript engines themselves directly, which will be interesting to see exactly how this works.
I just want to say to our listeners that Remult user and to future Remult users, you love decorators, that's great. Remult is for you. You hate decorators, that's great. Remult is also for you. Okay, because there are ways to define entities and fields without using decorators. It's sort of an implementation detail, the way you see it. We want your entities to have the metadata and to have the definitions required for Remult to work and save all that hard work from you. But it doesn't have to really have to be decorated.
Yeah, I know. Interestingly, decorators is kind of this polarizing topic. Some people really love them and some people really hate them. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm. You can use JSDoc with JavaScript. We actually have a project with an example for that. It works.
We had that request.
You don't have to use TypeScript at all.
Although TypeScript, we love it. So why? But that's a different that's a different discussion.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day,
it feels clean and simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll put it this way: for people working, especially just in the back end, being able to do without that extra compilation step is certainly a boon. The fact that you can just load the code, especially now that you're using the latest version of Node, it has really strong ECMAScript support built in. So you choose, and if you're using JSDoc, you just load it and it runs. Whereas for the front end, you probably need to compile anyway because of JSX or something like a Svelte or whatever. So you might, if you're going to compile anyway, then you might as well just use TypeScript. Yeah.
Well, I don't think that TypeScript compilation is not itself that slow, right?
Right. There's
Or is it
amazing
slow?
tools today.
Blazing fast.
There's amazing tools today that were done by Avenue. The Vite, for example, does that amazingly. And on the back end, there's TSX, it just runs Node with TypeScript seamlessly. So it's not as much as it takes time, but it is. Some developers don't like the interpolation. They want the code that they wrote to be the code that runs. And I can respect that, and
then,
for that, we fully support that.
And of course, you can just use Dino, which natively supports TypeScript. Kind of.
You mean Bun?
I think also Dino.
Of course,
no, Dino does too. It's just I like where Bun's going. Dino had its shot and it floundered, and I'm over it. But and also Dino is Rust, which is complicated. Bun is Zig, which is super simple. But
let's not go there.
The main reason that build steps are convoluted today, what is the main reason right now that build steps take minutes rather than seconds?
So they actually don't anymore. When I'm using Vite, it's really transparent. It just, the bundlings that it uses for the front end takes maybe a few seconds, even not a few seconds, a few milliseconds, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
What about Sass? Is Sass still a thing? Because that was the thing that seemed like it took the most time. It takes 4 or 5 minutes.
It seems that everybody has kind of left Sass for Tailwind or something. That's where everybody seems to be going. But it's not really my area of expertise, I have to say. I will roll with whatever the project creators decided to use. Usually I come into existing projects and help them work on improving performance. So usually it is what it is. And I hardly ever start a new project myself.
If I may circle back to something AJ asked before, I think he was trying to ask, well, this Remult sounds great for really simple CRUD stuff, but when things will get a little bit complex, then you'll have to just throw it out the window. And I just wanted to say that we've been using, ourselves and some people that we're in contact with have been using Remult for really complex applications and situations for thousands of end users.
To be clear, I was saying that more about Rails.
Okay.
Not Remult necessarily. Okay. I was saying that the Rails CRUD style is very, very simple relationships. But you clarified earlier, this is a library, not a framework. So it's not like I have to bust out of it. I get to use it where it helps, not where it hurts.
That's one thing. And also, we've taken trouble to really implement a lot of more complex CRUD scenarios. Some examples I can throw out are computed fields, which are not physically stored in a database, but are computed on the fly while they go back to the front end. We've implemented relations to a certain extent, not everything all the way, because we think it's an overly complex problem, but we've implemented some stuff. And there are other examples, and there's also obviously escape hatches. If you want to use raw SQL, you don't have to write your own endpoint. You can still use the Remult endpoints and then just translate your filter to raw SQL filters somewhere in these escape hatches we've prepared. So, and also, if you have
so just wait a minute before you move on, a question about that. So if I want to create my own handcrafted, custom, sophisticated SQL query, not rely on you for some reason because, I don't know, it's doing all sorts of sophisticated logic or stored procedures or I don't know what, I can do that, correct?
Yes, but even further than that, what Yoni just said, of course you can create your own custom sophisticated SQL and do that, because Remult is just a tool in your tool chain and you can always use anything else. But what we've taken even further than that is we found that in most cases, these SQLs were there to solve some kind of micro filtering problem. Like I want to query all the orders of customers who live in London or something like that multiple relations and multiple complexities. What we've done in Remult is we will allow you to box it, okay, box that part of raw SQL into a custom filter, and then use that filter without replacing entirely Remult. So you can benefit from the full CRUD capabilities, but still get to inject a raw filter that is extremely sophisticated using the latest and greatest SQL complexities.
So that was what I was aiming at. So you're not talking about saying, okay, you can use Remult, but if you need to, you can circumvent Remult. You're saying obviously you can do that, but you can also leverage Remult also in these custom scenarios as well. So I can have my own custom SQL query, getting data out of my database, feeding it into Remult, so that it then, from that point on, access to that data is done through Remult.
Correct. And even when you write that SQL, you can reuse, like, we have a translator that takes a Remult filter and translate it to an SQL filter or a Mongo filter or Knex filter. So even when you are building that custom part, you can still leverage other codes in your applications that represents the filter in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. AJ, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking that we probably should be moving towards picks soon. So in that case, I wanted to give you two a chance to, if there's anything that we neglected to mention or neglected to cover that you think it's important, now's the time.
So actually, before moving too much on, I want to circle back to something that AJ said earlier about over-designing solution and over-designing situations. For me, writing code in the last 4 or 5 years was an experiment on how much we can do for as little money as possible. I've taken upon myself to write some applications for NGOs, and I ended up, we wanted to prove Remult. We wanted to prove that it works on scale. So we wrote an application for a food bank distribution mechanism. There's food banks in Israel that distribute food to people in need every once in a while, like now in the holidays. So we wrote a small app like that, and it grew. Then COVID came and it exploded. It was used by the Israeli military to distribute food to cities that were in lockdown. It was used by multiple NGOs. And we had the privilege of taking the same code that was designed to service 50 food parcels, okay, and that was serving 17,000 food parcels in 2019. In 2020, it was serving 17,000 food parcels in a day. Okay, it scaled from what it used to do in a year to do in a single day. And I don't think we could have done that if we didn't have Remult. Because of the way the code was designed, using Remult, scaling up and scaling and making robust changes to the code wasn't that complicated. Okay, and we ended up today, we're serving about 450,000 food parcels a year, running on a server that costs me $16 a month. Okay, and for me that was amazing. I came from the enterprise business, from C# and SQLs and Oracles, and everything has to be thousands and thousands of dollars. And I too often see that a developer starts an application with $1,000 monthly fee for Amazon. Whereas you can do such amazing things with really starting from free with Railway and other providers, and even paying $16 a month can handle 500,000 food deliveries a year.
I have to agree.
So don't over-engineer, start simple and grow best you need.
Over-provision. Yeah. We are in a time where startups are starting to, be much more cash mindful, thinking about how to spend their money because it's difficult to raise more money. So all of a sudden, making efficient use of whatever resources and not over provisioning is becoming a really in demand, let's say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think Remult helps there by allowing you to get the time to market fast. You can build fast, deploy fast, get your market fast, and then grow.
So I have to say, I, as always was skeptical when we started the show. But you get the rare AJ award. Not that that's worth anything, but I'm interested in this. This sounds really well thought out, well designed. This sounds like something that I would use. I don't know when the next opportunity would be that I would use this. I'm not promising, hey, I'm going to go start using this. But I know that this is a tool in the toolbox, and this is something that I personally am interested in checking out, particularly if I can find those JS doc examples, or if you'd put those in the chat so we can have them in the show notes. I'd like to check that out. And on my next project where I'm considering using Go because of all the nice type safety and the just the ergonomics of that, I will at least look at the docs on this and see if it's worth trying it out in Node. Because I like what you're saying. I like that it's not tied to a specific framework. I'm a little bit fuzzy. I did look at some of the docs while we were chatting and stuff. I'm a little bit fuzzy on how exactly this is going to work with the different state management tools, because it seems like it has to have a strong tie-in with state management tools to be able to do that live updating and stuff like that. But I really like the idea that you generate some code where the API of how you access the data and save the data is the same on the front end and the back end, and that it's really focused on, do one thing, do it well, and be more of a middleware, whether it's a Node middleware or people don't really use the word middleware in React, but that's what this is. It's a state middleware or whatever.
Data fetching.
But the middleware approach is something that I personally think is a great approach. I'm glad that we had you on the show and that I got to learn about this and have my expectations overturned.
Yeah, and I'll add to that again, I don't know if when I'll need to be using something like this in a project, but listening to the way you describe it, it seems to me that it could integrate in an interesting way, let's say, with something like a React query as a means of really simple state management, because you probably don't need a sophisticated state management when you're database backed. You don't want to have multiple sources of truth. So doing something like a React query on top of it sounds really interesting. And another interesting integration, I think, might be trying to use something like this in the context of Astro. I mentioned that before our conversation. Because Astro kind of brings a lot of simplicity to how you build your front end, and you bring simplicity in how you manage the data. So I think it could be interesting to tie these two together. Again, I've never tried, so I don't know, but it seems like an interesting thing to try.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And one of the things that we try to do is to make it extremely easy to get started with Remult. So on the remult.dev website, there's tutorials on how to create a full stack app with React, with Angular, with Vue, and with Next.js. And we actually have videos of those, which are 1-hour videos from start to end. Currently, we have Next and React, and I'm preparing the Angular and Vue, and maybe later even Svelte. So anyone who wants to check Remult out can just go do the tutorial. It will take them, an hour and a half, and just feel how you start from, VCLI and end up deployed on the cloud, on Vercel or Railway within just an hour and a half. And one last thing that I wanted to mention, and I forgot earlier, so I apologize for that. One other thing that Remult does is also backend calls, which means imagine that you have API calls that just does something that is not as structured as CRUD, like, generate report or create a whatever. So we also made sure that these calls are 100% typed end-to-end, because we found that calling the API with the correct parameters and the correct parameters typing is a problem that still exists these days. So of course you can use tools like TRPC to solve that, but once you're within Remult, you can also use Remult end-to-end typing for that as well.
That's an interesting space right now that a lot of is going on in it. You've got, like you mentioned, TRPC, you've got Bling in the context of Solid and TenStack. We spoke with Tanner last week, and you've got what Quick does with server functions. And obviously React server components. So it's becoming a really interesting space of how to move data back and forth in a type-safe way, in ways that kind of simulate function calls or component integrations.
Exactly, and I think Remult fits extremely well into that landscape because none of these tools handle the CRUD. Okay, they support end-to-end type safety, but they don't cover the server-side sorting, paging, filtering, validation, authorization, even consistent authorization. Imagine those API where the user is not allowed to delete. I want him also not to see the delete button while relying on the same definition. That's something that no other tools does these days. And we really believe that the concept of having an entity with a single source of truth for typing, validation, authorization, anything else around it makes a whole lot of sense and makes CRUD applications easy.
Sounds good to me. So AJ, what do you say? We are going to be moving to Pix now?
Let's do it. Let's move to Pix.
Do we want the contact information before or after? I always forget.
Yeah, let's get contact information. Let's do it. That's important.
So obviously you can find Remult on GitHub, just REMULT or remult.dev.
And did we talk about what it stands for?
It stands for a name that we found that doesn't exist in Google. Actually, when we started our previous company 17 years ago, we've done that out of one room in my house that used to be in a street called Remult in
cool.
Ramat Gan.
A different spelling.
So with a bit of a different spelling, and we try to find something that when you Google it, you'll just find us. So it was a hard search, but we ended up with this name, and it's actually kind of cool.
So Remult on GitHub, remult.dev. How do people get in touch with you guys specifically?
So obviously we have a Discord that we are very attentive for. On our GitHub page, there's also our email and Twitter handle. So we are extremely available. And if you find any one of our videos online, you'll probably see my personal phone number as well.
If anybody wants to call you in Israel.
No, but the Discord really, just log into the Discord server and ask anything, and we're there. And also, I don't know if it's worth mentioning, if it's interesting, but Noam is going to be presenting Remult in a few conferences in the end of May, Dev Days Europe, DevVox Europe, and React Summit. So if anyone's there and wants to learn more about Remult and see some live coding, some really, I would call it a live coding show that Noam does on these conferences, then you're welcome.
Sounds cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get to the ending section here. So we got two things. One is self-promos, which is basically a dedicated space for you to unabashedly plug, obviously, Remult and anything else that you want to, because you can. And then the next thing is Pix, which is basically anything that you think is cool or awesome, and we're going to do the one first and the other second. So first, let's just do self-promo. I'll start with you, Dan, even though you don't have anything, and then we'll go to the other two.
Well, actually, this time I kind of have. I'm not sure if it's a pick or a promo. I'll be also speaking at a couple of conferences in the upcoming months. So I'll be speaking at the IJS London at the end of April, April the 27th. And I'll also be speaking at JS Nation in their virtual conference in June 5th. And I'll be speaking at a conference called J Nation in Portugal. So it's funny, JS Nation and J Nation, two separate conferences. I'll be speaking at that conference in Coimbra in Portugal, live in June. What is it? I think it's 6th or 7th. I need to check. I don't remember off the top of my head. One of these, either the 6th or the 7th. And finally, I'll be also speaking at the React Next conference in Israel towards the end of June. So if anybody wants to meet me, hear me talk about stuff usually related to performance, wants to chat with me about JS Jabber and tells us how much they enjoy our podcast. And, people have done it, and I really appreciate it when they do. So feel free to, approach me at the conferences, and, we'll chat about whatever. So yeah, that's my self promo. And by the way, I'm also looking for additional conferences for later in the year. So if anybody knows about an interesting conference that they would like me to attend, feel free to drop me a line. So that's my self promo.
All right.
Okay, so I'll go next. So I have a few things to say. So first of all, use Remult. Go to remult.dev, run our tutorials, play with it. And I'm going to be speaking, as Yoni said, on Dev Days Europe and DevVox Europe. And I have an amazing live coding sessions that I do. And so if you have a conference or just a group of interesting people who want to meet me, I'll be more than happy to fly over and do that. I've done that in Budapest, in Vienna, in Prague, and I'm doing that
Poor
in Amsterdam
you.
and Eindhoven.
Those are
I enjoy it.
no,
People buy me beers. So.
no, and those are really lovely cities. So what's not to like?
Exactly. Also, one other thing that I want to say here, I'll take this opportunity to use. We are, I think we love Remult and we have a great vision of where we want it to go, and we love contributors. I think that the notion of contributing to open source is booming these days, and not all contribution has to be code. There's a lot of contributions that can be done with content, with blog articles, with videos, and for me specifically as an Israeli with an Israeli accent and Israeli writing skills, any such contributions would be greatly appreciated. And if you love coding, if you love CRUD applications, please don't hesitate. Write something, do a video, do anything. I would help push it all the way around, and that would be an amazing contribution to the Remult success story.
Let me start by thanking my wife, of course.
Now you've got me in trouble.
and a lot. Third, that's the first, second, and third thing I want to say. And the fourth thing is, of course, give Remult a spin. Check out the repo. Give us a star. Try it out, and most importantly, give us feedback. We really love getting feedback. We love hearing what people have to say. You don't like it, you do like it. You're having problems starting out. Our documentation sucks. Anything really. We just love feedback. So give it a spin and tell us what you think. That's the most I can ask.
All right. And then what I've got, so BNNA is coming together. That's cloud hosting, privately owned all the way down, and cheaper by the bunch. So by privately owned all the way down, we've got privately owned servers that we privately own in a privately owned data center. We are going to, but the landing page will go live either today or tomorrow. So it'll be out by the time that this is out, as well as probably our first payment method, which will be Dash, which is digital cash. It's a privately owned cryptocurrency. It's not VC backed or anything like that. And then we also have a privately owned credit card processor that uses privately owned banks. So this is a complete decentralized, censorship-resistant infrastructure. It is privately owned in every possible way that we have been able to find privately owned. So there's no funny business from outside sources, and we do have redundancy in multiple layers, and in layers where we don't yet have secondary privately owned partners. We are still looking for that, and if you know of some that are in any of those categories, let me know. And then,
so when you say we, you mean yourself and Ron Swanson?
I don't know who that is. I know it's a meme.
It's the libertarian. It's the libertarian guy from the Parks and Rec show.
So it's Ryan Burnett and Jojo Bite. So those are the three of us.
No, I was just kidding.
Far.
Good for you. I really approve of what you're doing. That's what it is.
Thanks. And then by cheaper by the bunch, I don't know what the pricing is going to be. I'm going to throw out wacky numbers that aren't entirely real, but something like 50 cents a month for 64 megs of RAM and an 8th vCPU, up to $200 a month for 128 gigs of RAM and 12 vCPUs. Wow. So those numbers, I've tried to pick numbers that are ridiculously, not ridiculous. They're probably off. They might be off by an order of magnitude. But basically what I'm saying is you can get with us cheaper than you can get anywhere else on the cheap end, and the price actually goes down as you need more. So rather than one banana $1, two banana $5, three banana call for enterprise pricing, it's one banana $1, 10 banana $5. That's kind of what, and we can do that because it's privately owned all the way down. There's no VCs, so there's no pressure to inflate prices or do so-called parity pricing, where people who are doing better have to pay more. I really don't like the idea of parity pricing, which is what you see with Amazon and with most of these other cloud providers, where the quote unquote poor people get in for free, but then the quote unquote rich people have to pay exponentially, as things go up. So we're flattening that curve to just a linear scale. Pardon any political. That wasn't meant to be political. That was just literally talking about the curve on the graph. So yeah, and then I won't do a pick because I took up too much time with that. I didn't mean to speak that much about it, but we'll do picks too.
I have a question for that. So, will it also support like managed deployment, like Heroku or Railway or those kind of tools, or will it be more bare bones?
Our aspiration is to do the hybrid approach. So, I actually really like what Heroku does. Heroku could have been a runaway success if it weren't VC backed, because they don't own any of their own servers, so they have to piggyback on Amazon. And as Amazon's prices scale up, Heroku's prices have to scale up. And since they had free customers for 10 years, somebody has to pay back the money for the free customers. But in terms of their tooling, we all like the tooling that Heroku provided, but with the caveat that you should still get root access. So you should be able to have your cake and eat it too. There's no reason that you can't have a container and have root access to that container. So I'm out of the gate. We're doing a container model, but it's going to feel like VMs. It's going to be container pricing with VM access is kind of the mix. But as we're able to develop the tooling, I suspect that it's going to feel like the convenience of Heroku as we get the tooling out. But starting out, it's going to be very, very simple. Just, you buy a bunch, and then you can allocate within your bunch what you buy a bunch that has some units of RAM, some units of CPU, and if you can make 64 megabyte containers and that solves your needs, then you can make 8 64 megabyte containers inside of it. Whatever fits in your bunch that's what we're planning to release, is that you get an allocation, you fill the allocation whichever way you want. We'll give you a couple of, quote unquote, click button options for, that'll work for the average use case. But it's cheaper by the bunch because you're going to buy a bunch and then you're going to fill out that bunch with what you need. So it's going to feel like DigitalOcean, like a cross between DigitalOcean and Heroku.
I feel like saying challenge accepted. To see what I can do with 64 megabytes.
You can run a web server. You can run a Node Express server.
Yeah. You can.
You probably can't run the build process on there, but you can run the actual service.
Yeah.
Anyway, but let's talk about it later.
Cool.
And then, so picks.
Yeah, so I'll start. So my first pick is, we're just past April 1st. At the time of the recording is April 3rd. So there were obviously the whole bunch of obligatory April 1st pranks and jokes and stuff. The one that I liked most, though, was a tweet from the Solid.js guys who fake introduced a new API called create, so you can do const my app equals await create, and then you pass in a parameter which is a string describing what you want the component to do, and it would use ChatGPT to generate the code that actually does that thing for you. So it was like a new ChatGPT based API. I really like that April Fool's joke, which kind of reminds me of my second pick, which is, so somebody suggested to me that an interesting thing to do is to ask ChatGPT about yourself, that if you've done anything, of note before 2021, you can then maybe it'll know about it. So it was really interesting. So I asked ChatGPT what it knows about myself, and it exactly shows the benefit and also the problems or limitations with ChatGPT. So it actually provided a pretty good summary of who I am and things that I've done and what I'm known for, but it included some subtle mistakes that would be difficult to catch for somebody other than me. So, for example, it mentioned that I worked at Wix, but it also mentioned that I worked at Akamai, which I never did. Or conversely, when I phrased the question differently, it said that not only did I work at Wix, but that I was one of the founders of Wix, which, I wish, but but I'm not. So no, we actually had Nadav Avrahami a few episodes back, and he is one of the founders of Wix. So yeah, so I know how that looks like, but it's but it's not me. So that kind of just shows both the strength that it wrote a pretty good overview summary, pretty flattering, by the way, of who I am. But like I said, some subtle mistakes that could easily slip through if you're not familiar with the topic matter. So that's kind of the big challenges with the whole ChatGPT thing for me. And those would be my picks. Oh yeah, and the ongoing war in Ukraine, where everybody can do what they can to help the people of Ukraine. I always mention that. So those would be my picks for today.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I like to reflect that about ChatGPT. We should remember that ChatGPT was never designed to be right. It was designed to sound well. Okay, the entire design behind ChatGPT is to show that it can write articles that will be well written and well read, not necessarily factually true. Okay, and so we shouldn't take its word for it. I've seen it write code samples that were amazing with packages that never existed, like npm my perfect solution, which just there's no package like that. It doesn't do anything that it says, but the code looked really, really smart. So we should remember that it's designed to demo that and not much more than that. Yeah, and so for mine, I want to give a shout out to Thunder Client, which is a VS Code extension that just gives you Postman experience within VS Code. It's really simple, it's really great, and I use it tons, both for presentation and for development. And it's obviously free, and the VS Code extension, which I think is a great tool. And Yoni, again, your wife.
Yeah, my wife. Yeah, I wasn't really prepared for this part of the talk.
Oh, you have a favorite movie, a favorite book, a favorite artist, whatever.
We can stay with software frameworks and libraries. Not that it needs my shout out, but I just we discussed it now a few days ago. That some meetups where Noam presents Remult, we show Remult using we start up with a Vite based React project, and some people are not aware of what is Vite, which is very funny for me because I thought it was kind of the new mainstream. But if it doesn't really need my shout out, but I think Vite is fantastic. Just works well, does what it's meant to do, not trying to do more than what it's supposed to do. Extremely fast, simple to use, and we enjoy it very much. So thank you for Vite. That's my pick.
That's from the guy who created Vue.
Evan Yu.
Yeah.
Evan Yu. Exactly.
Evan Yu.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing tool, and it's changing the industry. Everyone now uses Vite.
Oh yeah, for sure.
SvelteKit uses Vite. Angular is going to change to Vite on the next version.
Solid is using Vite. Yeah, I think Ryan Cognato, the creator of Solid, kind of talked about the fact that it kind of created like a platform that all the framework creators can actually build on and kind of jumpstart framework development, because it does a lot of the heavy lifting that they needed to do themselves.
The only framework which I think is not moving in that direction is Next.js, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah, they're creating their own thing with what's it called, TurboPack, I think.
Yeah. I'm not sure why they're doing that, but
they can. They're VC funded. Sure. They have the money.
That's okay. That's okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
All right.
Just because they can is a great answer.
All right. I will add one pick, which is Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. I'm playing it through again in order to get my hype up to the on par level for a Zelda fan for Tears of the Kingdom. And goodness knows, I think I said this last episode, but I mean, I'm just I'm playing the game really slow, and I'm trying to visit all the different areas, and it's just amazing. I think in my first 200 or 300 hours of playing the game, I think I only visited about a quarter of the map. It's insane. Oh, and I'm looking forward to Tears of the Kingdom. I'm hesitant, but I'm looking forward to it. So, with that, thanks everybody for coming on, and we look forward to your continued improvement and success with Remult. And I don't know what else I need to say to end this thing, but we'll go adios.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.